This morning. We are in Leviticus, the 4th chapter.
I was too, that's what happened to me.
And Leviticus chapter 4 and 5, just to recap what we talked about last week. The purpose of Leviticus 4 and 5 is talking about sin offerings. And specifically, these are sins where a sin was committed unknowingly, that you find out after the fact that you had sinned, and there is no other restitution to be made. As we get further along in this process, we'll see that there are sins that have a restitution, they have a price or compensation that are to be paid. We talked about the high priest, that the high priest was to offer a bull without blemish, that the congregation was to offer a bull without blemish. A ruler or a leader was to offer a goat without blemish. And so now we're going to pick up in verse 27. So Leviticus chapter 4 and verse 27. All right. It says, if any one of the common people sins unintentionally in doing any one of the things that by the Lord's commandment ought not be done, and realizes his guilt, or the sin which he has committed is made known to him, he shall bring for his offering a goat, female without blemish, for sin which he has committed. He shall lay his hand on the head of the sin offering, kill the sin offering in the place of the burnt offering. And the priest shall take some of its blood with his finger, and put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering, and pour out all the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. And its fat he shall remove, as the fat is removed from the peace offering. And the priest shall burn it on the altar for a pleasing aroma to the Lord. And the priest shall make atonement for him, and he shall be forgiven. And if you'll remember, we talked about last week the fact that these sacrifices did atone for sin. So they did, once they offered these sacrifices, receive forgiveness. But it's a temporary solution to a permanent problem. It's a Band-Aid solution. Because they're going to leave and just, guess what? They're probably going to go sin again. So we needed a one-time sacrifice. So then we get into verse 32. If he brings a lamb as his offering for sin, he shall bring a female without blemish, and lay his hand on the head of the sin offering, and kill it for a sin offering in the place where they killed the burnt offering. Then the priest shall take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger, and put it on the horns of the altar, a burnt offering, pour out the rest of its blood on the base of the altar, and all its fat shall remove from the fat of the lamb is removed from the sacrifice of peace offerings. And the priest shall burn it on the altar on top of the Lord's food offering. And the priest shall make atonement for the sin which he has committed, and he shall be forgiven. Now, so we see that if just the average everyday person were to sin, they have the option of either a female goat or a female lamb without blemish. All right, and if you stop and think about it, we'll talk about the turtle doves here in a minute. God is giving a provision of this is what you should do, and it should not be an economic hardship for them to make atonement. The idea being is that forgiveness is not unattainable, right? Forgiveness is not unattainable. Because if you went to the average everyday person and said, okay, every time you sin, you've got to offer a bull, it's like, that's a lot. Like even today, right? A bull is a lot, right? You're talking, if it were today, and numbers like this are relative, right? But you're talking several $1,000s every time you sin, right? That's, I would be in debt up to my eyeballs paying off sin. So God made the system to where it was attainable. And bless you. So let's keep reading. Because now we get into some very interesting, so up until this point, chapter 4, these have been generalities, right? If this person sins unintentionally, if this person sins unintentionally. Now we get into chapter 5, and we're going to get into a little more nitty-gritty, all right? chapter 5, verse 1, if anyone sins in that he hears a public adjuration, to testify, and though he is a witness, whether he has seen or come to know the matter, yet does not speak, he shall bear his iniquity. All right? So let's stop right there. All right? If you hear a public adjuration, a public call to testify, you remember, they don't do it as much anymore, but it used to be, if you have any information on this specific crime, call Crime Stoppers at 255-CRIME, so it's that situation of if something has occurred and there's a public request for testify, for witnesses, and you are a witness, whether it's because you saw it or you have come into contact with knowledge of the matter, and then you do not speak about it, he shall bear his iniquity. And so effectively, this is the biblical equivalent of if you see something, say something. That's what it is. And so, which brings up a very fascinating thing of the difference in minding your own business and standing up for what is right, right? That's, the difference in being a busybody, of being in everybody's business, because remember, Paul is going to talk about in the New Testament the dangers of running around and gossiping and being a busybody. The difference in that versus if you know something wrong has been done, sitting and not doing anything about it, right? And so for the Israelites, they are called to, if something wrong has been done and they know about it, they need to talk about it. They need to not be afraid. If you see something, say something. And so that is a personal community responsibility. It's very interesting to me. So I for several years, did some research into bullying and school bullying and those kinds of things. And the research shows that in a school environment, and granted, I understand, there's a lot of variables at play, but in general, I'm allowed to make a generality. In a bullying situation, if someone will stand up and say something, hey, that's not right, hey, I'm going to go get a teacher or the principal or whatever, but if somebody will just stand up and do the right thing, not go fisticuffs, not go fight, but just stand up and call out the problem, most of, the number's like 80% of those situations stop right then and there. And so, now, that's hard though, because you ask a kid, right, to, stand up and do the right thing in front of their peers, like that's a hard thing to ask of them, I get that. But the principle is there, is that if you know the right thing, you know the truth, and don't tell the truth, well, according to Leviticus, for the Israelites, he shall bear his iniquity. He'll hold on to his sin, is the idea. All right, verse 2. If anyone touches an unclean thing, all right, whether a carcass of an unclean wild animal, or a carcass of unclean livestock, or a carcass of unclean swarming things, and it is hidden from him, and he has become unclean, and he realizes his guilt, or if he touches human uncleanliness, or whatever sort the uncleanness may be, with which one becomes unclean, and it is hidden from him, when he comes to know it, and realizes his guilt, or if anyone utters with his lips a rash oath to do, let's stop right there, or if anyone, let's keep going. If anyone utters with his lips a rash oath to do evil or do good, or any sort of rash oath that people swear, and it is hidden from him, when he comes to know it and realizes his guilt, when he realizes his guilt in any of these and confesses the sins he has committed, he shall bring to the Lord as his compensation for the sin he has committed a female from the flock, lamb or goat for a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for his sin. All right? And so, all right. We are So the situation is that you have become unclean by touching something that is unclean. We'll get into all the nitty-gritty about what's clean versus unclean later on. All right? But the idea is if you came into contact with something that was unclean, you then became unclean. All right? If you'll remember, we talked about the fact that there are two law codes in the Old Testament, in the Mosaic Law. Okay? There are the moral laws, do not kill, and then there are the ceremonial laws. All right? And this would fall under the ceremonial category, right? And you say, how do I know that? Well, A, I know it because the rabbis talked about it. But B is when we get into the New Testament, the ceremonial law code is done away with. The moral law code continues through the New Testament, right? So I can eat bacon as a Christian, but I can't go out and kill somebody, right? There's a difference. Nevertheless, though, in the Old Testament, sin is sin. In the New Testament, sin is sin, right? And so God has said, do this thing or don't do this thing. And sin at its most base level is disobeying the will of God, right? So if God were to give a new revelation, right? If God were to give a new revelation and say, no more sneakers. Okay. Christians cannot wear sneakers because sneakers are worldly and not in heaven. I don't know. I'm not God. But if he were to make that commandment, even though I'm like, that seems weird, God, I would have to go along with it because God has said, don't do this thing, right? Or, conversely, if God came down and said, yeah, no, it is a sin to be on social media. And then we get off of social media, right? I have a love-hate relationship with it. It is very useful, beneficial, and I'm on it more than I should be. But at the same time, I realize I may be better without it. So, but the point is that a sin at its most base level is when we disobey what the will of God is, right? Now, that has implications, right? Go into all the world. That's a commandment, right? Be a light. Seek and save the lost. Do good to all men, especially the household of faith. Sin is doing things God said not doing, and sin is also not doing things God said to do. So, all right. So, touches an unclean thing, and then he realizes his guilt, right? So we're still in that, I didn't mean to sin. Yeah. All right? Now, this one, though, is interesting. In verse 4, if anyone utters an oath, all right, to do evil or good, any rash sort of oath, and it is hidden from him. Now, was he not there when he made the oath? What do you reckon it means when it says when it was hidden from him?
You didn't know what it meant?
Possibly. Possibly.
Just mad and just spewing off something and then go on his way and somebody kind of points it out to him, or he realizes, oh, shoot, I shouldn't have acted like that.
Mm-hmm.
So hidden would be not recognizing at the time, one of two ways, self-reflection or somebody's pointing it out.
Yeah. I think, quite simply, it's hidden from the brain, right? So have you ever run it, and we've all run into this, I think, where my mouth said words that my brain did not clock, right? Don't get me wrong, it came from my brain, but it was the automatic part of my brain that said it. And had I used my filters, Matt may not have said that thing, right? And so I think that's what it was. Hidden is that you said something, and after the fact you went, oh, yeah, probably shouldn't have said that. Or texted it, or emailed it, or whatever form of communication you chose, right? Good news, when we make mistakes, God gives us an out. And so, now, here's the thing though. This is a specific kind of thing. God gives us an out always, but in the text, it's a rash oath, okay? Now, the thing we've got to remember is that oaths for the Old Testament was a very important thing. If I made an oath, then that is like sealing the deal, signing the contract, right? And so I swear that if I ever see you again, so my background is in early American church history, so that period of like 1760 to 1860 is my jam, especially frontier preachers. And there's a frontier preacher, and I gotta find his name, because I came across him when I was doing my thesis research. But he's in probably West Virginia, I think that's where it was. And he wrote in like their version of the Gospel Advocate or the Christian Chronicle, okay? He wrote in their version of the Christian Chronicle, if this person ever shows up to this part of West Virginia again, if there is cap and ball to be found, there won't be enough for him. And so, effectively, if this Christian shows up to this part of West Virginia, I'm going to shoot him dead, is what he is communicating. And different time, I guess, but the idea is that he should not have said that. That's not a very Christian-like attitude, right? And so it just goes to show that we all can find ourselves making statements, and he was making it with authority. He was making it as a guarantee. If this ever happens, this will be the result. So as they would make oaths in the Old Testament, right? So they would make an oath to do something. And if they were really meaning it, they would invoke God in the process, right? So they would say, by God, I swear that this will be the case. And if you remember, one of those commandments, thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain, right? That's what that's about, is the idea of using God as your proof, right? An oath, your word, needed to be backed by something if you made an oath. So if it was your character, it was your character. But if more often than not, they would appeal to a higher power. God, strike me dead if I don't do this, or if this doesn't happen. And so,
That would be scary if he did.
say it again.
I said that would be scary if he did.
But he did. That's how he rolled back then. All right. And so back then, God'd be like, okay, you didn't do the thing. Bye. Like, because right, if there was no possibility that God was going to get involved, then the oath would have no power. And if God wasn't willing to get involved, he probably would not have said, don't do this thing, right? So the oath was an important part of culture for them, right? And even to this day, when you go over to the Middle East, any of the Eastern countries, this idea of honor and your word and those kind of commitments are still very, very prevalent, right? We talk about in this country about how, used to be you could just have a handshake and it was good enough, right? And so for this person, they've entered a rash oath or vow, and then he comes to know his guilt, and he then goes to make restitution. Notice, verse 5, he realizes his guilt in any of these. So any of the last things we just talked about, touching unclean things, making a rash vow, and confesses the sin he has committed. Confession is an intrinsic part of the process. Okay? Now, again, not like Catholic priests sitting in a box, confession, right? All right, but in this situation, they would have to go confess it to the priest, right? And so in the Old Testament, you would go and say to the priest, high priest, I was, out and I saw one of my lambs laying on the ground. I went to check it and come to find out it was dead, right? You would confess your sins to your priest. Today, right, we still have an obligation of confession, but that obligation of confession is to God, right? Now, me letting you know about a sin, because sometimes you'll hear me talk about, if you've sinned in a public way or need to pray, sometimes everybody needs to know about it, right? Sometimes people need to know about it just because I need your help on it. But if I confess my sin to you, it's not because I'm expecting you to judge me. I'm confessing my sin to you because I want you to be in the know. The only person that has a role in the forgiveness of my sin is God, right? Now, if I sinned against you, I may want your forgiveness in that situation, right? So, but for the Israelites, forgiveness is intrinsically tied to that relationship between the priest, the sacrifice, and God, right? Which again, all of this stuff is a preparation for in the New Testament, right? Because Jesus is now our high priest, right? And Jesus gives us the power and authority to go to God in prayer to ask for forgiveness. He is the mediator, right? And so, same concept is actually there in the New Testament. All right, any questions up until this point or comments? All right. All right. So if he can't afford a lamb, that's verse 7. If he can't afford a lamb, then he shall bring to the Lord as his compensation for the sin he has committed 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for the sin offering and the other for the burnt offering. He shall bring them to the priest, who shall offer first the one from the sin offering. He shall wring its head from its neck, and shall not sever it completely. He shall sprinkle some of the blood of the sin offering on the side of the altar, and with the rest of the blood he shall be drained out at the base of the altar. It is a sin offering. Then he shall offer a second for a burnt offering according to the rule, and the priest shall make atonement for him for the sin he has committed, and he shall be forgiven. But if he can't afford 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, then he shall bring as his offering for the sin that he has committed 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour as a sin offering. He shall put no oil in it, he shall put no frankincense in it, for it is a sin offering. And he shall bring it to the priest, and the priest shall take a handful of it as a memorial portion and burn this on the altar as the Lord's food offering. It is a sin offering. Then the priest shall make atonement for him and for the sin offering he has committed, and any one of these things, and he shall be forgiven, and the remainder shall be for the priest, as in the grain offering. All right. So again, God sets up rules so that no one can't achieve forgiveness. No matter what your life situation is, if you want forgiveness, you can achieve it, right? So if you can't afford, a goat or a lamb, bring 2 pigeons, right? Or 2 turtle doves. Can't afford that? Then bring an ephah of fine flour, right? Excuse me, 1/10 of an ephah. Let's see, about 2 liters would have been what it was, around about 2 liters, right? Think about a 2-liter of pop, right? That much. Look, if you ain't got nothing else, find me 2 liters of good flour and use that. Every situation, and you remember, right? The corners of the fields were left there. Why? So that the poor and the sojourners could come in and glean from the fields. So even if you had 0 money, go out in the fields, you could glean. Now, get it to find flour is going to take time on your part, right? And that's the thing. This 1/10 of an ephah would have just taken your time more than anything, right? Or a little bit of money, you could have bought it. But basically, everybody has an opportunity at forgiveness, right? And, sometimes when we think about the Old Testament, we think about, people will say, well, God was a God of vengeance and wrath and anger in the Old Testament, but he's a God of hope and love and forgiveness in the New Testament. And that's not true. He's the same in both Testaments. In the Old Testament, he is a God of love and hope and forgiveness, so that you can be the poorest person in the community, but you have every right to forgiveness as the richest person. All right? And that was not always a popular thing, right? Wealth inequality has been an issue since wealth has become a thing. And so, but God in his providence wanted to make sure that everybody had an opportunity. All right? Any thoughts, questions, or comments on that?
When the rich person gives his lamb or his goat or anything, didn't the Pharisees or the priests or something get the rest of that meat?
In some of the situations, they would get a portion of it. The priests would get a portion of it, not the Pharisees.
So
But,
they got something out of this. So if you sin, bring me your goat or bring me your lamb because I have all this food now.
well, so it's a functional thing, right? So it's a functional thing, right? Because you had people who were serving in a ministerial capacity, the priests, right? Minister just means serving the needs of others. That's all it means, all right? And if you're a Christian, congratulations, you're a minister. And so all it means is to serve the needs. But the priests serve specifically the needs of the faith, right? So they're setting up and taking down the tabernacle. They're moving the tabernacle. They're offering the offerings. They're prepping this. They're checking this. And that's all they do, right? And when they get to the promised land, they're going to start handing out the land. And guess what? Levites, they don't get nothing. And so they don't have land, right? And they are full-time working, well, they don't have inherited land. Some of them marry into land later on. But their occupation is the service of God. And so there needs to be some way for them to be compensated for their time, right? And in a time and place where you didn't just walk around with a bunch of money, right? It's easier to have them take a part of the sacrifice. But, all right, so that's one component, is it's just a matter of practicality. But also, is that it's very frequently a part of a meal that was had, okay? And so you would have these sacrifices that would go to the priest, and it would become part of a meal. And interestingly enough, these kind of principles of the priest getting a portion of it actually date back into antiquity, into pagan religions would do the exact same, where the priests would get a portion of what was offered. So it's actually a way of God taking what is a cultural concept and using it for his glory. Now, not everyone, not all the pagans were honest about it, all right? There's a historical account in ancient Greece, it's one of my favorites, where they had a big statue, and I don't remember if it's Zeus or Dionysus or one of the Greek gods, and they would put their offerings on it, and then they would shut the door to the temple, they would seal it, and then when they would come back the next day, the gods had eaten all the food. Well, there was a king or leader who went, I don't know, something just doesn't seem quite right about this. So one day, when they're putting out the food, he sprinkles flour on the floor. And then they close it and seal it, and when they come back, they find, sure enough, there are footprints going to the wall that had a secret passage, and come to find out, the priests were taking the offering and hiding and then just eating it all in the night. And so But for God and the Israelites, he acknowledged and understood, the meal component of it, because a meal is one of the closest forms of fellowship that you can have, okay? It is one of the closest forms of fellowship. It's how you get to know people. It's how you spend time together. And we talk about fellowship and we joke about, fellowship is just code for potluck, right? And it is, right? But the reality is that you will learn more about someone in 30 minutes of sharing a meal together than you would in just about any other environment. And so God knew that. So there's a portion to some of this where it's about sharing a meal. There's also the practicality of it, of these guys are working every day and they don't have a side job, so they gotta get taken care of somehow. And so then there's the practicality of it. But by the time of the first century, the process has gotten so muddled and so messed up that it has basically become a scam. But at this point, when God gives the instructions, it is given with the best of intentions, the best purposes, and man gets involved and messes it up, as so often is the case. Other thoughts, questions, or comments? All right, well, let's keep going to verse 14. All right, Leviticus 5 and 14 says, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, if anyone commits a breach of faith or sins unintentionally in any of the holy things of the Lord, he shall bring to the Lord as his compensation a ram without blemish from the flock, valued in silver shekels according to the shekel of the sanctuary, for a guilt offering. He shall also make restitution for what he has done amiss in the holy thing, and shall add a fifth to it, and give it to the priest. And the priest shall make atonement for him, and the ram of the guilt offering he shall be forgiven." All right? All right. Let's see. Let's keep going here. Make sure we don't skip anything. All right, that's pretty general stuff. Okay, so we'll back up a second. Okay. All right. So if someone were to sin unintentionally in any of the holy things of the Lord, so in the tabernacle complex, right? So because they would go around and they would sanctify it and consecrate it. So if it occurs in the tabernacle complex, because that's where all the holy things lived, were kept. All right. Then in that situation, all right, they were to offer a ram without blemish, valued in silver shekels, and so they, according to the shekels, according to the shekel of the sanctuary, all right? And then they were to add to that a fifth to it and give it to the priest, okay? These are, it was a ram without blemish, and it was reckoned according to the priest estimate of the value of the trespass plus 20%. There's a conversion chart on what one ram equals X amount of shekels, and then plus 20%. You have to be good at math to be a priest. Like, there's math going on here, numbers. But effectively, so the value, and if the value is not in the animal, then the value can be in money. Simple enough. So you'd offer the ram plus 20%, right? And there's a combination of how that works out, you know. So then it keeps going to say, if anyone sins doing any of the things that by the Lord's commandment ought not be done, that he did not know and realizes his guilt, he shall bear his iniquity. He shall bring to the priest without blemish out of the flock or its equivalent for a guilt offering, the priest shall make atonement for him for the mistake that he made unintentionally, and he shall be forgiven. It is a guilt offering. He has indeed incurred guilt before the Lord. All right? So again, it's just re-emphasizing the situation. This is a sin that someone has done unintentionally. He's going to bring a lamb, or excuse me, not a lamb, a ram without blemish. All right? So again, this is for a sin, that is brought, words is hard also. It is a ram that is brought because he has sinned without knowing, and it is something that is done in the holy place, or it is a sin that he's doing something that ought not be done and did not know it, right? And so, this, rather than knowing not to do it and accidentally doing it, versus not knowing to do it, or not knowing not to do it and doing it, right? And so it's the same concept of, I didn't know it was wrong. It's the difference in, but you should have known better and you didn't know better, right? That's effectively what we've got here. And again, these are all, he's trying to cover as many situations as he can. He's also doing them in generalities. And so that way, if God were to make rules for every single sin that could be committed in every single situation, this room could not be filled with the books that it would take to handle every single situation, right? So you got to have generalities. All right, let's keep going. Chapter 6, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, if anyone sins and commits a breach of faith against the Lord by deceiving his neighbor in a matter of deposit or security, or through robbery, or if he has oppressed his neighbor or has found something lost and lied about it, swearing falsely in any or all of the things that people do and sin thereby, if he has sinned and he has realized his guilt and will restore what he has took by robbery, or what he has got by oppression, or the deposit that was committed to him, or the lost thing found, or anything about which he has sworn falsely, he shall restore it in full, and shall add a fifth to it, and give it back to him whom it belongs on the day he realizes his guilt. And he shall bring to the priest as his compensation to the Lord a ram without blemish, or its equivalent, for a guilt offering. All right? So again, the punishment, or the restitution, as far as the sin, is going to be make atonement by a ram plus 20%. And so, well, this one's just a ram, excuse me. Now, it's important to note, all right, there are two parts of this, right? So this is the situation. This is somebody who takes advantage of someone else, right, by either they took a security deposit or a deposit on something, or they robbed them. Some sort of theft is involved, okay? And there's two parts of this. There is the restitution, and then there is the atonement part, okay? And so the restitution part is the value plus 20%, and then the atonement part is the ram, okay? And so you have, it